Hi, good afternoon, friends. My name is Ming, and I'm a generic Googler. I'm delighted today to introduce my friend, Laurie Hope. Laurie is a journalist, a speaker, and a producer of more than 20 documentaries. And she has won dozens of awards, including 2 Emmys. Her work has been featured in the media, including the Wall Street Journal, Time Magazine, ABC News, and Oprah, the Oprah Show, where she did not jump on the sofa, which is kind of surprising. It turns out to me that I found out that not every guest on Oprah jumps on the sofa. It's like, yeah, strange but true. Laurie is a cancer survivor herself, and she's the author of the book, Help Me Live, 20 Things People with Cancer Want You to Know. I'm surprised it's not 21, but 20, I guess 20 is a good number. Laurie has spoken before dozens of groups, including the American Cancer Society and UCSF. And she has consulted to companies including Aflac Insurance, and I had to do that, and Scientific Learning Corporation. She's a shesource.com expert, and she currently writes for various media, including carepages.com, where her helps, hurts, heals blog. It's hard for a Chinese guy to say that. Let me say that helps, hurts, heals blog is among the site's most popular blog. And my friends, let's welcome Laurie Hope. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks. Okay, so it's Friday morning. You just got to work. You're checking your email. You're in a great mood. You look up and you see a friend who you've been working with for about a year walking up towards you. And you know she's been having a really hard time with a project, and she has a huge deadline looming, and she's been talking with you about whether you think she should ask for an extension. So she walks up to you, and you expect her to ask you about the extension again. But instead, she says, "I have cancer." What do you say? And what do you do? And just as important, what do you not say and do to avoid hurting somebody whose world is already imploding? One thing you probably don't want to say is, well, at least you don't have to worry about that deadline anymore, even though you might be thinking that. Because when you have cancer, you don't want to hear what's good about it at all. What you want is compassion. Now, these kinds of situations can be really difficult and really uncomfortable, and sometimes it feels like nothing you say is right, because people are all different, and what is soothing to one person might be, very painful to another, and people change from day to day. But I'm here to tell you that there is great hope. Not only hope for finding the right thing to say or the right thing to do, but hope that you can use these kinds of encounters to strengthen and deepen and enrich relationships. Now, I'm here this afternoon to give you tools that you can use here at work, or you can take home or to the grocery store, that'll make you feel more comfortable in some of life's most uncomfortable situations. And I'm here to tell some stories and share some stories about what helps and what hurts and what heals people with cancer. And I'm here finally to share what I call the other secret, which is that the more you give, the better and the more authentically, and maybe even the longer you live. And we'll talk about some of the science behind that. Now, how do I know some of these things? Well, I'm not a doctor and I'm not a psychologist, but I am a cancer survivor myself who knows firsthand what it's like to hear those words, "You have cancer." I'm here second as a journalist and an author who interviewed scores of cancer survivors and mental health professionals and communications professionals about what helps and what hurts and what heals. And I wrote the book, Help Me Live, 20 Things People with Cancer Want You to Know. And I'm here third as a friend and loved one of many people who've had cancer, 2 of my very best friends and 2 of my first cousins. So I know how hard and how uncomfortable it can be. And I also know how rewarding it can be. So I'm going to go through some of the things that people with cancer have said that they want other people to know, but they're too polite or sensitive or traumatized to share themselves. But first, the backstory. About 6 years ago, I went to my doctor. Her name is Dr. A, and I went for a routine checkup. And during the exam, she was palpating my abdomen, feeling my abdomen, and she felt a hardening. And I had had fibroid tumors, so she thought that maybe they had grown. So she ordered a CAT scan. So I went in for the scan, and I had my first case of what those of us who've had cancer call scanxiety. I became very nervous. Went in for the scan, though, and while I was still on the table after the scan in the very cold, dark room, and I was just terrified, the radiologist came out of his little booth, and he stood over me, he took my hand, and he had this beautiful halo around his head. But it was actually just the light, but it looked like a halo because what he said to me is, "Ooh, it looks like your abdomen is completely clear. You have impacted stool." So I was just thrilled and relieved and left that cold, dark room and ran into the warm, loving arms of my husband. And we were so excited we went out to get a nice glass of wine to celebrate. We got home a couple of hours later and the phone was ringing. And it was Dr. A. And she said, "Lori, the radiologist took another look at your scan and he saw a shadow on your lung. You need to come in for another scan on Monday." Of course, this happened on a Friday because these things always happen on a Friday when you have the whole weekend to marinate in it. Long story short, I had lung cancer. Constipation saved my life. But I didn't know that then. The tumor was very small, although the oncologist said, "It looks like it's very small, but we could open you up and find hundreds of tiny tumors in there." So that's what I saw in my mind's eye. But boy, I was shocked. And I was terrified and I was devastated. I was shocked because although I was a smoker in my 20s, I quit 17 years before I was diagnosed. And it was not even on my radar that I could get lung cancer. And I was terrified and devastated because I'd never heard of a lung cancer survivor, anyone who lived, and I thought I was going to die. So the good news was I was scheduled for a lobectomy to have an entire lobe of my lung removed about 2.5 weeks out. And the other good news was I was just about to leave 2 days after my diagnosis on my annual family vacation with my best friend and her family. And we rented a house by the Russian River, and we were really looking forward to this. And I was very excited because my best friend, Barbara, is one of the most loving and compassionate people on the planet. She is just amazing. She's the kind of friend where, whether you've gained 5 pounds and you're complaining about it, or you've forgotten somebody's birthday, whatever, she will just look at you and say, "Lori, I love you." She just she's fabulous. So I was very excited. The day before I left, I got together for a latte with another friend, and I was sharing with her how excited I was about this trip. And she said, but do you think you're really going to be able to have a good time on this trip, knowing that you're going to come back and face this like major surgery? Excuse me? I was like, yeah. Now, normally I would have been kind of annoyed by that. It's like, well, of course I'm going to have a good time, you know? But I was so vulnerable and sensitive and terrified that I really just like spun out on it and started obsessing and thinking, why am I going on this trip? I'm not going to have a good time, and it's just a waste, and I should be here getting ready. But went on the trip, and as soon as I saw Barbara that next day, I knew that we had made the right decision, because she immediately told me that she had already scheduled massages for us the next day. So I was like really feeling great. But the next morning, the first day of vacation, I popped out of bed like a piece of toast, which I did every day after my diagnosis because I was so, I was so anxious. And I went out, it was again 5 in the morning, and I sat on the deck and listened to the soft roar of the Russian River below, and the full moon was still in the sky. It was like a mother of pearl button. And I was writing in my journal, and I wrote, somebody ought to make a documentary, because that was my background, documentary, or write a book about what to say and not say to people with cancer, how to support somebody with cancer, because it was just so obvious that people didn't know. Other folks had asked me other questions and made comments that indicated that they just didn't quite get what it was like. So I got home from the trip, and I was really excited, and I went to my therapist, and I said, I've got this idea, and I really want to make a film about this. And she immediately, nixed it, put the kibosh on it, said, no, get through your cancer, and then you can talk about making a film or whatever. So I did. I got through it, and I got back to normal, which was a miracle, because when you're going through this and afterwards, it's just normal doesn't mean anything anymore. Your world is completely changed. And sometimes you feel like you're never going to get back to who you were, but I did. And I was teaching a documentary production class in San Francisco, and one of my students came up to me after class, and she said, making a film and writing a book are so similar. Have you ever thought about writing a book? And it turns out that this was the publisher of 10 Speed Press, a publishing house in Berkeley. And I said, well, as a matter of fact, when I had cancer, and that's how the book, Help Me Live, came to be. Now, initially, it was designed for friends and loved ones and colleagues of people who have cancer. But like children, books can develop kind of a life of their own, and it developed a following among cancer survivors because it validates their feelings. It makes them realize that they're not so different and that they're not alone. And it also developed a following among people who have had other diseases and even war veterans. I was doing a reading at a library, and a Vietnam veteran came up to me afterwards and said, you could write a book like this for war veterans, what we want other people to know. We don't necessarily want to be asked, not necessarily, we don't want to be asked if we ever killed anyone. And these are questions that people ask us. So this book, which developed this following, has kind of developed a life of its own. And now I go out and speak and try to spread the gospel of compassionate communication. Because this is really just about being a good friend, these principles. And also, it's about being a good coworker, which is really important. And it's why I'm really, really thrilled to be here today, because I consulted on a project with Aflac Insurance, and we did a survey of more than 900 unpaid caregivers to find out what helps and what doesn't help. And we found that the least helpful group of people is colleagues, coworkers. And why is that? Well, for one, our coworkers are not our chosen people. We may become very good friends, very close with our coworkers, but most of the people who we work around don't really know us. And in fact, sometimes our coworkers may even be impacted by our illness in a negative way. And gosh, it's hard to even say this, but they may have to pick up some of the ill person's workload and may feel resentful. And that's a horrible thing to feel, resentful of a friend of a coworker who's sick. But these kinds of feelings really do come up. So I love being here to talk with you about what your friends and colleagues may be going through here at work. So I'm going to go through some of the 20 things that people with cancer want you to know. And I'm going to start with the first statement, which I'm going to illustrate through a story, another story involving my best friend, Barbara. Barbara and I also go away once a year, just the two of us, and we usually go away to the Oregon coast. She lives in Portland. And we go away and stay in a motel, and we eat fabulous smoked fish, and we drink great wine, and we take walks on the beach and do whatever in the heck we want. We watch movies. And this trip was different, though, because Barbara had just been diagnosed with breast cancer. Now, it was DCIS, ductal carcinoma in situ, which means basically 0 stage. You have cancer cells, but there's no tumor. So that's very good news. And I was glad to hear that, but I resisted saying to Barbara, oh, you're so lucky. It's only DCIS, because again, you don't want to hear what's good about having cancer. But she postponed one of her radiation treatments so we could go away for a long weekend. And while we were driving over the mountain from Portland to the coast, she said, you know, I am feeling so sensitive and raw right now. Let's try to keep it really positive this weekend and not complain about anything. I thought, well, that's going to be kind of hard because that's, you know, we like to complain. But I said, you know, that is a great idea. And I remember when I had cancer, I did not want bad news of any kind. You know, I did not want to read a newspaper. I just didn't want to hear about anything negative because I wanted to keep all my energy positive. So we're driving over the mountain and we're talking about movies. And I asked Barbara whether she has seen Al Gore's movie, An Inconvenient Truth. And she says, no. I said, oh, wow, it's really amazing. And I start giving her a summary, and I'm telling her about the crane that lifts him up and how cool that is. And without realizing it, my summary turns into a rant about global warming. I just sort of lost control. And I glance over at Barbara, and her hands are on the steering wheel, and her knuckles are white. And she says, Lori, this is really, really scaring me. Can we talk about something else? I could not believe that I had done exactly what she had asked me what not to do, and that I knew better. But we all mess up. And that brings us to the first statement, which is, it's okay to say or do the wrong thing. We all do it. I mean, I wrote the book literally on it, but I still mess up. We all do. We think without speaking, or we speak out of our own fear. We're afraid that we're going to get cancer ourselves. We're afraid that our friend's going to die. We're afraid for what our friend's going to go through. We just get wrapped up. And what's important is that we admit to our friend or our colleague I don't know what to say. I want to be there for you, but I'm afraid I'm going to say the wrong thing, and I'm really sorry if I do. Apologize in advance. And forgive yourself, because you're going to say the wrong thing. Sometimes nothing you say is right. But it's okay. It's really okay. What isn't okay is to disappear because you're afraid of saying or doing the wrong thing. As Barbara Kingsolver said, the friend who holds your hand and says the wrong thing is made of dearer stuff than the one who stays away. The next statement that people with cancer want you to know is, I need to know that you are here for me. Aristotle said that man is a social animal. And if man's a social animal, I don't know what woman is. We're very social. We need people around us, and especially when we're hurting, when we have cancer, when we're depressed, when we've lost someone we love. But it's so common to find that somebody disappears. It might be a good friend, it might be a sibling, it might be the person who you'd never expect. And at the same time, other people who you may not have been that close with come to your side and rally. And it's beautiful. Some people, apparently though, don't have a great capacity for emotional empathy. When I started researching this book, I thought everybody was capable of feeling empathy and compassion. But Dr. Paul Ekman at UCSF, who wrote the seminal book on facial expressions, said no, people have different capacities, and some people, it's just not their strong point. And there are some people who maybe you don't want around you when you have cancer because they are negative or they may not be helpful, but there are so many ways to be there for people, even if you can't be there physically or emotionally. You can send cards, you can send gifts. If you're a gifted researcher, you can offer to do internet research. You can create a web page for somebody. There are so many ways to help. When I was diagnosed with cancer, I was consulting to a company called Give Something Back Business Products. It's an office supply company that donates more than half of its profits to nonprofits, and I still work with them. And when they found out I had cancer, they sent me 3 boxes of gifts that each staffer had chosen, him or herself. And little things, candles, incense, little books of quotations, plants, just little things, but it meant so much to me. And also greeting cards signed by all of them. And I felt so loved and so supported. As sensitive as you feel when you have cancer towards negative things, you feel just as sensitive towards positive things and kindness, and it just means the world. Another client I was consulting to, I was making a video for, they all chipped in and, got my house cleaned for me, which is a great gift, because when you have cancer, money worries come up. No matter how many resources you have, you get very scared about things. So there are many, many ways to be there for people. Oh, I want to tell one story about a girlfriend of mine named Marcy who had breast cancer. And her brother wasn't very emotionally supportive, but what he lacked in emotional intelligence, he made up for in financial resources. He had a villa in Tuscany. So when she completed her treatment, he gave her a month at her villa with her husband and frequent flyer miles to go over there. Now, my brother has a condo in Palm Springs, and I've told him this story twice, but he still has not gotten it, but that's okay, because he doesn't know what it's like. He doesn't know how terrifying it is to have cancer. I am terrified. I am terrified. Now, I want those of you in the room who haven't had cancer, or maybe even if you have, to close your eyes for just a moment. Close your eyes for a moment and remember a time that you felt really frightened. Really frightened. Maybe it was September 11th, 2001. Now, double that, or triple it, or multiply it by 10 times. And that's what it's like for most of us when we hear those words, you have cancer. And so you can open your eyes and you can let go of that feeling. But it's very hard to do when you have cancer. It's very hard to shake yourself of that because, I mean, even though half of us are treated and cured, which is, when you make it beyond 5 years, half of us are walking around and we're living happy, productive, normal lives. There's still this terror around cancer and still this stigma. And so it's terrifying. A therapist who I interviewed who's a Nazi Holocaust survivor as well as a 2-time breast cancer survivor, her name is Helena Irving, and she's been running support groups at UCLA for about 30 years. She describes the feeling of having cancer as feeling like you're being chased by a tiger in the woods because you have this adrenaline and you're running for your life. And when we are so terrified and traumatized, we actually regress emotionally. So, like a toddler who's been potty trained and undergoes a trauma and has to go back to the diaper, that's what it's like for many of us, not all of us, but for many of us who receive a cancer diagnosis. Brings us to the next statement. My moods change day to day. Please forgive me if I snap at you. When I had cancer, I felt not so much like a toddler in diapers, but I felt like a teenage girl with PMS on steroids because I was wild. I was so scared and so sensitive. And partly what scared me was that I was going to bark or snap at or bite someone I loved dearly and that I would hurt them, and also that they might go away, which is the most terrifying thing. So it's so important to just give people who are sick, suffering with cancer or any disability, disease, give them a pass. Understand that sometimes it's just overwhelming to them. That brings me to a cartoon. I don't know if any of you have heard of this book. Cancer Made Me a Shallower Person, a memoir in comics by Miriam Engelberg, who had breast cancer. And this is one of my favorite cartoons. I don't know if you can see it. I'll go through it. It's called Valium in the Workplace. And Miriam says, after finding out I was metastatic with breast cancer, I dreaded facing people at work. And she says to her sister, I have to go pick up my cartoons from my office. And her sister very kindly says, well, I'll go with you. So first Miriam emailed her boss to let her know that she was coming. And Miriam says in the email, my cancer is metastatic. I'm coming in tomorrow to pick up some things. Please let everyone know, but tell them that I don't want to talk about it. Signed, Miriam, stay away from me, Engelberg. So in the morning, she sets off for work. And she says, oh my God, I'm hyperventilating. She's so nervous about going back to work. And so she takes a Valium, and her sister does too. So by the time they get to the office, the Valium has kicked in, and some coworkers are standing around. Miriam says, hi, and a couple of coworkers say, oh, hello. And then the one woman says, and then now where did I put my coffee? And then the next frame you can see everybody's running away from her because they're so afraid. And she says, maybe I went a bit overboard in my email. I just love that cartoon because it just points out how uncomfortable it is. But you gotta laugh about this stuff. You really gotta laugh. And in this case, Miriam didn't want to talk about it. She really didn't want to deal with it, but most of us really do want to talk about it. One of the statements that we need you to know is, I need you to listen to me and let me cry. As the Dalai Lama said, sometimes silence is the best answer. Or as David Spiegel from Stanford said, I love this quote. Oh, I wanted to say one of the most wonderful things you can say to someone, you can ask somebody when you find out they have cancer is, do you want to talk about it? Would you like to talk about it? But as David Spiegel said at Stanford, if you see somebody crying, don't just do something, stand there. Well, that's often easier said than done. It can be very hard to listen. You want to offer the benefit of your experience, of your knowledge, you want to offer advice, but often all you need is just to feel heard. You just want to tell your story. Partly, you want to tell your story so that you believe it's true. You know, you need to tell your story. And I want to tell a story about listening. And once again, it involves my friend, Barbara, indirectly. I was going up to see her for one of our annual getaways, and I took a train. I treated myself to a sleeper car, partly because when you're going north, you come through the woods first thing in the morning, and you come out to see Mount Shasta. I don't know if any of you have ever seen Mount Shasta, but it is an awesome, literally awesome mountain. And when you come out in the morning, you see it in alpenglow. It is one of the great miracles of life. So I woke up in the morning and I went to the dining car to sit and look at the beautiful miracle, awaiting the miracle. And I was seated with a man who looked kind of dour, which I was very happy to see because I didn't want to talk with anybody. I just wanted to look out the window. But I couldn't help myself because I'm a very friendly person. And so I said, hey, so where are you going? He said, oh, I'm on my way up to Salem. Oh, well, what are you doing up there? I'm moving my business. I have a pizza business, and I'm moving it from San Jose up to Salem, Oregon. And I said, I asked what I thought was a very benign question. I said, are you moving with your family? And he said, I'm moving with my wife and son, but my daughter, who was 21 and just graduated from college, was killed in a car accident 2 months ago. And I felt like I had been punched in the stomach. So I cannot imagine what it must have been like for him. I just cannot imagine that kind of loss. And I said, I'm so sorry. And then I almost said, I have a 21-year-old niece. And I almost asked, how did it happen? But I decided, I made a conscious decision, I'm going to open my heart to this person, and I'm going to take in his pain. And I'm not going to interrogate or educate or advise. I'm just going to listen. So I looked at him, and I opened my heart, and he started telling me the story about how it happened and about how it impacted his family, and about how he came to get on that train that day because he was moving his family up to Salem because it was just too hard to stay close to where the accident happened. And then, when he was finished telling his story, he looked at me and he said, So, where are you going? And then the conversation, a normal conversation, ensued. And at the end of the breakfast, we were saying goodbye, and he looked straight at me and he said, "Thank you for listening to me." And I said, "Thank you for sharing that with me." And I realized at that moment that I had missed the miracle of Alpenglow. But I had experienced a different kind of miracle. The miracle of human connection. It felt so good to know that I had helped this man. It felt so good. The Dalai Lama said, if you want others to be happy, practice compassion. If you want to be happy, practice compassion. It feels good to help. We started discovering that in the Western world anyway. In the early 90s, when Alan Luke's coined the term helper's high. He's also the author of The Healing Power of Doing Good, as well as being at the Institute for the Advancement of Health. And he surveyed more than 1,700 volunteers. And they said that when they volunteered, they actually had a physical, locatable, pleasant feeling. And that they felt kind of high and warm, and they had more energy. And that it was most intense when they were touching or actually just listening to somebody. And that these feelings recurred when they would remember the feelings, which is really cool. There's an anatomical basis for this. Several studies have shown that we release endorphins when we're helping people. And a recent study that showed intensified activity in the midbrain, and this is through functional MRI tests, when we were involved in helpful activities. And this same region lights up when we are involved in things like eating enjoyable food or having sex. So you can sort of extrapolate what you want from that. But, maybe helping is as good as eating food or having sex. I think it's pretty good. Now, this can result in actually improved mental health, helping people and listening to people. Carolyn Schwartz said, the act of giving to someone else may have mental health benefits because the very nature of focusing outside the self counters the self-focused nature of anxiety or depression. Now, this can have lifelong benefits. There was a study of 200 individuals who were followed from the time they were children, and these were actually individuals in Oakland, California. And they were surveyed until they were in their 20s. They were surveyed twice a year, and then they were surveyed every decade. And the key to happiness was generativity, which is giving. So the people who gave more felt happier. And they found that people who tested high for giving in their teens even were healthier and happier half a century later. And apparently, you can even live longer when you're giving. A study out of the University of Michigan followed 423 elderly couples for 5 years. And the people who provided no help at all, either practical or emotional, were more than twice as likely to die than their altruistic peers. Now, earlier I said that Dr. Paul Ekman said that some of us have a lesser capacity for emotional empathy. But according to other studies, we can actually retrain our brains, taking advantage of the brain's neuroplasticity. Douglas LeBeer, who's a psychologist, was writing in the Washington Post that as you refocus your thoughts, feelings, and behavior in the direction you desire, the brain regions associated with them are actually enforced. So you can actually learn compassion as well as behavior. And here's a behavior that we can all learn: asking permission. Asking permission can spare me pain. Now again, when we find out that someone we care for has cancer, we want more than anything to help them. And often we think that we can help by giving them advice. And sometimes that's true. But often when you're diagnosed with cancer, you are just barraged with advice and information, and you're overwhelmed with decisions. And when somebody offers you more advice, it can just add to that sense of overwhelm. So if you simply ask, would you like to hear some advice, or would you like to hear about a book I just heard about that's supposed to be very helpful, that can make such a big difference. So ask permission before giving advice. Ask permission before asking questions, because sometimes people don't want to talk about it anymore. And some people are very private. So if you just say, can I ask you some questions, or would you rather not talk about it? It's okay. That can make a huge difference before visiting somebody who's sick, especially in the hospital. Because when I was in the hospital right after my surgery, I was really lucky. I had an epidural. So my pain was taken care of. I was feeling no pain between that and the narcotics. But one day the epidural came out, and I was in awful pain, and they were trying to get it fixed. And a woman, the wife of a colleague of mine, just stopped by to say hi to me in the hospital. It was very sweet. But I didn't know her well enough and didn't feel comfortable enough to ask her to leave. So I just sat there and I endured this visit and tried to kind of entertain her. And that could have been avoided had she just called. And she meant absolutely no harm, but just making a simple phone call. And finally, before telling other people, again, some people are very private about their cancer. And it's not the kind of thing that you necessarily think about saying to people, please don't tell anyone about this, because again, you're overwhelmed. But it's a great, great gift, a mitzvah, to ask somebody who's ill, would you like me to tell other people, or would you not? One woman recently emailed me, and she told me that when her husband had cancer, he did not tell one soul at work that he had cancer. And he said that was because he didn't want to be cut off from the herd. Cut off from the herd. I thought that was so sad, that he was afraid of being cut off from people. That's why it's so important that we draw people into the herd and we let them know how much we care for them and accept them. The next statement, I need to feel hope. We all need hope. Now, hope is defined by Dr. Jerome Groopman, who wrote the book, The Anatomy of Hope, and he is a Harvard oncologist. It's defined as the elevating feeling that we experience when we see a path to a better future. And Dr. Groopman, who's a wonderful writer, and he's a staff writer actually for The New Yorker as well, highly recommend his books. He says, hope, true hope, has proved as important as any medication I might prescribe or any procedure I might perform. What are some things that destroy hope? I call them hope busters. Number one, seeing disease as a punishment, that you somehow did something to deserve cancer, or to deserve depression, or to deserve MS, or cerebral palsy, or anything. Feeling ashamed or feeling blamed. For instance, even thinking that you brought on your own cancer because you smoked, or you got breast cancer because you drank a glass of wine every day. You just don't. That's not a way to build hope. Also, horror stories. Hearing about other people with your kind of cancer who did not fare as well. And often, when we hear someone has cancer, we just react from our own experience. And so, you hear somebody has breast cancer and you'll say, oh, my friend had breast cancer and she, had to have both of her breasts removed. And so you'll say something like that without thinking. You want to hear success stories. You also, hope is dashed by hopeless caregivers when your doctors or your healthcare providers relate a sense of hopelessness or fail to relate a sense of hope towards you. Now, what are hope builders? Again, success stories. And I collect success stories. So when I hear about somebody who had leukemia 10 years ago and who's still doing well, or who had melanoma 20 years ago, I try to keep that in my mind. And when somebody tells me that they have melanoma, I make sure it's the same kind of melanoma, the same kind of disease. I'll share that success story with them. And the other big hope builder is humor. A study in the International Journal of Humor Research of 200 people who watched, half of whom watched a 15-minute comedy video and half of whom did not. The people who watched the comedy video had a significantly higher level of hope than those who did not. The next statement, I need to forget and laugh. We need humor. In my internet survey, this was the #1 statement that resonated with people who've had cancer. You just need to get away from it. When you live in cancer land, it's hard to escape. We're not like children who seem to be able to get out of their sadness or their grief and play. So we often need help, and a great way to help your friends or your colleagues is to take them to a comedy show or take them to a movie. Just help them forget and help them laugh. And the last statement I'm going to go through is, I need you to understand if I don't return your call or don't want to see you. When you have cancer, again, you're in cancer land and you're so busy. Even if you're off work, it's like you're so busy doing research, seeing doctors, getting tests, and it can be really overwhelming, and especially for people who have children. A story about this, it's actually a story I tell in my book, and it happened to my step aerobics instructor who was diagnosed with breast cancer, and she had 2 young kids. And her husband sent out an email to her whole list telling them that she had cancer. And that night, one of her best friends from high school called her up, left a voicemail, and said, Tony, I'm so sorry to hear this. Can you call me back? I want to talk. So Tony heard the message that night, but the next 2 days were so busy with seeing doctors and figuring out her treatment plan, she just could not get to a phone. And her friend called 2 days later and said, Tony, I really need to talk to you. Please give me a call. Tony meant to call her back that evening, but her 9-year-old son came home with poison oak that day. So it just, obviously, she didn't call her friend. The third time her friend called, she said, Tony, My husband says I'm just being a selfish bitch. But I really need you to call me. What do you think? Was her husband right? No, I wouldn't say that she was being a selfish bitch. But I would say that she just didn't have any sense of what her friend was going through. And she was thinking about herself and her own need to talk to her friend and for her need to feel needed. Because when somebody's sick, we want to feel like we're one of the special people who gets to be there to support them. But sometimes you're not that person. You live too far away. So it's really important to just try to have compassion and know that maybe they just can't see you right now, and it's not about them. So now that we've gone through some of these statements, I want to go through the top 5 things not to say to someone who has cancer. Besides, of course, you've got to call me back, because that's something you shouldn't say. Okay. You have to try shark gonads, or whatever mushroom, or whatever new treatment is out there that you just read about on the internet. Makes you want to say, when somebody says that, you have to try thinking before speaking. You know, because again, nobody wants to be told what they have to do. Nobody likes that. But especially when you have cancer or you're involved in any kind of crisis and you're being given a lot of advice. So again, what you might say is something like, do you want to hear about a new treatment that I just heard about, or do you want to hear about a new book I just read about? And if not, that's okay. It's part of God's plan. Now, I recently spoke at a melanoma conference, and I heard from a mom of a young woman who had melanoma. She was 20 years old. And the mom said that a woman at church actually said that to her and her 20-year-old daughter with melanoma. It's part of God's plan. It makes you want to say, well, I wonder what God has planned for you. I mean, really. This young woman said she was so upset that this church lady said this to her because, what kind of God would plan this for you? When somebody says that, you want to say, the God that I love and I believe in doesn't give people cancer, but maybe she's there to help us through it. So what you might say to somebody, is just, I'm sorry to hear this. Nobody knows why these crappy things happen to people. Nobody knows. How are you? People will often say that in a kind of condescending way, in a more pitying way rather than a compassionate, heart-to-heart way. Or it can feel that way when you have cancer. And that makes you want to say back, well, I'm fine. How are you? And of course, I would never say this to people because I'm a kind person and I'm not sarcastic. But these are the things that you'd kind of like to say if you weren't so kind. And especially, again, after you've finished treatment, you might want to forget about it, and you might actually be able to be in that blissful state of normal again, where you actually wake up and you're not thinking about cancer. And when someone comes up and says, how are you, or how's your health, it can take you back there. So usually it's better to just say, hey, how are you doing? How are you doing? And if the person feels comfortable enough with you, they'll say, oh, I've got a CAT scan coming up, I'm a little nervous, or, I'm starting another round of chemo. And if they say, hey, I'm doing great, then just leave it there. Let them take what communications professionals call the communicative lead. Let them lead the conversation. And then number 2, you just have to think positively and everything will be okay. Oh yeah? You try thinking positively when you have cancer. Boy, wouldn't we all love to think positively all the time? And although studies show that hope can help heal and that a positive attitude and hope can strengthen the immune system, sometimes it's just not possible. Sometimes it's okay to feel sad and depressed and to think negatively. And when people tell you that you have to think positively and you just can't get it together to think positively, you can feel scared that you're making your cancer worse or guilty. You're causing your own cancer because you're thinking so negatively. So it's better to just say, I'm here for you. Whether you think positively or not, or no matter how you're feeling, I'm here for you. My best friend Barbara said to me when I had cancer, you're going to have up days and you're going to have down days. And I just encourage you to accept whatever you're feeling when you're feeling it. And those words have stayed with me for 6 years. And I actually said those words back to her just a couple of days ago when she was going through a hard time. And finally, what not to say. Oh, you have lung cancer? My aunt died of lung cancer. Like, oh, you got those shoes at Nordstrom? My aunt got those shoes at Nordstrom. Thanks. That gives me something to look forward to. Again, we want to relate to other people and share our experiences, and sometimes we'll just blurt something like that without thinking. But it takes your mind to that place. I could be your aunt. I could die. So again, better to say, gosh, I'm sorry to hear that. Do you want to talk about it? I'm here for you. It's so unfair. Now, 5 things to do when your friend has cancer or is hurting in any way. And I'm going to illustrate these with some visual images because I know some of you might be visual learners. And you can put these in your toolbox, and I use them to remember. First, ask permission. Just ask permission, especially before offering advice. Refrain from telling horror stories. Number 2, help your friend forget and laugh. And number 1, just be there. Just be there and just listen. And if you have a dog or a kitten, bring your dog or kitten over to visit. Now I'm going to tell one more story. It's about a woman, a colleague, who I've worked with, and I'm not very close with her. Her name is Michelle, and she is a very fiery, passionate woman. She's Italian. And she is also the executive director of the Youth Employment Partnership, which is a nonprofit that provides job training for youth in East Oakland. She's a very hard worker, and she's also a mother of 2 kids. And she has a grandmother who had breast cancer when she was 90 years old. And she had a lumpectomy and chemotherapy, and she is now 99 years old and still alive and doing very well. Well, this grandma taught Michelle how to make biscotti from the old country, from Sicily. And Michelle, who's, again, an extremely busy woman, I just called her day before last, and she didn't get back to me till the next day because she was in a meeting until 10 o'clock at night. It's a very busy woman. When she found out that I had lung cancer, she made me a big batch of biscotti and delivered them to my front door in a beautiful glass jar with a gorgeous bright yellow ribbon and a greeting card that wished me well, and 5 other cards. These cards, postcards, 5 other cards, asking me to let her know when she could deliver more biscotti to me. Now, I'm telling this story not just to illustrate how the smallest act, although this isn't so small, baking biscotti, but something so relatively minor can make such a huge difference. That made me feel so good. And I remember this, 6 years later. And almost every time I talk with her, I mention this. I talked to her today, and I said, I'm going to tell this story because it's so inspiring. There are so many ways that you can help people. I'm going to end with a quote, and this is by the Swiss priest and author Henri Nouwen. And he says, when we honestly ask ourselves which people in our lives mean most to us, we often find that it's those who, instead of giving advice or solutions or cures, have chosen rather to share our pain and touch our wounds with a warm and a tender hand. The friend who can be silent with us in a moment of despair or confusion, who can stay with us in an hour of grief or bereavement, who can tolerate not knowing, not curing, not healing, and face with us the reality of our powerlessness. That is a friend who cares. I want to thank all of you for caring enough to be here. And I wish all of you well. And I'm happy to take any questions. Yeah. Questions? Yes.
You talk a lot about the relationship between friends. What about between parents and children? Parents have kids. What have you learned from them?
Well, I've learned that there can be, of course, a kind of role reversal, right? Parents are supposed to be taking care of their children. Many parents are resistant to being cared for by their children, especially males. I don't know if you've had this experience. And I think it's really important and very difficult sometimes to respect your parents' wishes. And you might think that you know better than them in some ways, and you may, and I don't know if I'm addressing this situation you're in, I'm just relating to the people I've talked with. But it's important to respect your parents' wishes. On the other hand, as a child of someone who has cancer, it can be so painful and disorienting because your parent is supposed to be the strong one, and it can be very difficult to see them in a weakened state. That's why it's so important for caregivers, friends, and loved ones of people who have cancer to have support as well, through a support group if that feels good, or a friend, because support groups aren't helpful to everybody. Some people just don't feel comfortable sharing. But it's so important to be able to vent your feelings and to feel heard yourself, because people who are sick can become very, very self-centered. One of the 20 things that people with cancer want you to know is, I want my caregiver to take good care of herself or himself. Because you do want your caregiver to take care of yourself, but sometimes you're not very good at expressing that. I remember when I had cancer, it was, mainly about me and my poor husband, who was so scared himself. But it was hard for me to hear about his fear because I was so terrified. So I don't know if that question, if that answer addresses what you're... you thinking?
Sorry.
Or-
So we're
and-
out of time. So we can just come forward and talk to Laurie, or alternatively, we have a room in Building 41, Wichita, in 20 minutes time, and we can talk to her then as well. Thank you.